Imagine being the best fighter pilot in the world and still being told you are not good enough to fight for your own country. Imagine training harder than every other man around you, flying better, shooting straighter, thinking faster, and then being handed a mop instead of a cockpit. Imagine watching your country go to war, listening to speeches about freedom and democracy and justice, and knowing that none of those words were meant for you. That was the reality for hundreds of young black men in America in the early 1940s. They were not asking for special treatment. They were not asking for medals or parades. They were asking for one thing, one simple, extraordinary thing, the chance to serve. And what happened when they finally got that chance is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire history of human warfare. This is not just a story about airplanes. This is not just a story about World War II. This is a story about dignity. It is a story about what happens when a group of people who have been told their entire lives that they are inferior decide to prove, in the most dramatic fashion possible, that they are not. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, the men who flew into the fire and came back with something no one could take away from them. A record so clean, so perfect, so historically unprecedented that the United States military would never be able to look at black soldiers the same way again. Before we go any further, you need to understand something about America in the 1930s. The country was divided in ways that most people today can barely comprehend. Segregation was not just a social custom. It was law. It was enforced. It was protected. Black Americans could not eat at the same lunch counters, drink from the same water fountains, or attend the same schools as white Americans. And the United States military, the institution supposedly built to defend freedom, was one of the most segregated organizations in the entire country. The Army Air Corps, the branch that would become the most prestigious fighting force in the sky during World War II, had a simple, direct policy about black men. They were not allowed. Period. Full stop. No exceptions. The official position of the United States military establishment was that black men were intellectually inferior, psychologically unfit, and physically incapable of handling the stress and complexity of aerial combat. These were not whispered opinions. These were published conclusions, written into official military documents, used to justify a wall that seemed completely impossible to break through. But here is what the military establishment did not count on. They did not count on a group of young men who had grown up reading about the Wright brothers and Charles Lindbergh, who had built model planes in their bedrooms and pressed their faces against fences at airfields, who had dreamed, really dreamed, of flight. They did not count on the determination of those men and their families and their communities. And they absolutely did not count on the political courage of a handful of people who decided that this particular wall was going to come down. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen really begins with a woman named Eleanor Roosevelt. In April of 1941, the First Lady of the United States visited Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the historically black college that had been founded by Booker T. Washington. Word had reached Washington that an experimental military flight training program was being set up there, a program designed, in part, to prove once and for all whether black men could fly combat aircraft. Eleanor Roosevelt was 60 years old. She had been told by her Secret Service detail that this visit was a security risk. She ignored them. When she arrived at Moton Field, the small airstrip adjacent to Tuskegee Institute, she met a young flight instructor named C. Alfred Anderson. Anderson was one of the first black men in America to earn a commercial pilot's license, and he had spent years fighting for the right to fly. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at Anderson and asked him a question that would change history. She asked him if he would take her up. Her Secret Service agents nearly had heart attacks, but Anderson helped the First Lady of the United States into a small plane, and they flew over Alabama together for about an hour. When they landed, Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly turned to her hosts and said something to the effect that she had always heard that Negroes could not fly, but now she had seen for herself that they could. She went back to Washington and told her husband. She wrote to her husband, She lobbied and pushed and advocated. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had his own complicated relationship with civil rights, ultimately signed off on what would become one of the most significant military experiments in American history. The formal program was called the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and it was established in March of 1941. The military selected Tuskegee, Alabama as the training site, partly because the weather was good for flying year-round, and partly, truth be told, because Alabama was deep in the segregated South, which meant the black trainees would be completely separated from white military personnel. The base they trained on, Tuskegee Army Airfield, was entirely segregated. The mess halls, the barracks, the officers' clubs, all of it divided by race. Even the base hospital had separate wards. And yet, into this environment came some of the most extraordinary young men America had ever produced. The candidates who arrived at Tuskegee were not ordinary recruits. The military had set the selection standards extraordinarily high, some said deliberately so, to make it easy to wash out candidates and shut the program down. The men had to have at least 2 years of college. They had to pass the same written and physical examinations as white pilot candidates. They had to demonstrate exceptional aptitude in mathematics, physics, and mechanical reasoning. What this meant in practice was that the men who showed up at Tuskegee were teachers, lawyers, engineers, college graduates, and star athletes. They were the best educated group of military recruits in America. Names that would become legendary in the years ahead began to appear on the training rosters. Men like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the son of the first black general in the United States Army, a graduate of West Point who had spent 4 years being silently shunned by every white cadet in his class. He ate alone, slept alone, and studied alone for 4 years, and graduated in the top half of his class anyway. Men like Charles Debo, Spencer Hirsch, Mac Ross, and George Spencer Roberts. Men who had been told their dreams were impossible and had decided to have those dreams anyway. The training at Tuskegee was brutal. Not because the military wanted to prepare these men well, though some of their instructors genuinely did, but because the physical demands of combat aviation are brutal for anyone, and because the Tuskegee trainees knew that every washout would be used as evidence against the program. When a white pilot washed out of training, it was a personal failure. When a black pilot washed out of Tuskegee, it was treated as proof that the entire race was unfit for flight. That pressure, that impossible, suffocating, collective pressure, hung over every single training flight, every examination, every navigation exercise. And yet the men persevered. The washout rate at Tuskegee was actually lower than at many comparable white training facilities. The men were flying. They were good at it. They were getting better every day. By the spring of 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first class of Tuskegee graduates, was ready for combat. But getting to the front was its own battle. Military commanders argued that the squadron was not ready, that its men lacked the experience, the cohesion, the instinct for combat. Benjamin Davis, who had been given command of the 99th, argued back. He had the records. He had the training data. His men were ready. Finally, in April of 1943, the 99th shipped out to North Africa, becoming the first black military flying unit in American history to serve in a combat zone. They were assigned to the 12th Air Force and flew their first combat mission in June of 1943, targeting a German-held island called Pantelleria in the Mediterranean. The island fortress that military experts had said could never be reduced from the air fell within days of sustained aerial bombardment. The 99th had played its role. They were in the fight. But the fight to be accepted was not over. Some white commanders filed reports suggesting that the black pilots were performing poorly in combat, that they were breaking formation, showing cowardice under fire, unable to execute combat maneuvers at the same level as white pilots. These reports were taken seriously in Washington. There was talk of shutting the entire program down. Benjamin Davis flew back to the United States to testify, before a military review board. He sat in a room full of white generals and colonels and calmly, methodically, destroyed every claim that had been made against his men. He brought records. He brought performance data. He brought testimony. And slowly, painfully, the board concluded that the evidence did not support disbanding the program. The 99th would continue, and something even bigger was about to begin. In January of 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron was joined by 3 more black squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. This was the unit that would become known to history as the Red Tails. The nickname came from the distinctive paint job the group adopted for their P-51 Mustang fighter aircraft. While many American fighter groups painted their aircraft nose or tail in various unit colors, the 332nd painted the entire tail section of their planes in vivid red. Those red tails became a symbol, first of identity, then of excellence, and finally of something that no enemy could dispute and no prejudice could erase. Under the command of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the 332nd moved to Italy and was assigned to the 15th Air Force. Their primary mission was bomber escort, flying alongside the heavy B-17 and B-24 bombers as they made their long, dangerous runs deep into Nazi-held Europe. Bombing missions over Germany and German-occupied territories were extraordinarily dangerous. Not because of the flak, though the anti-aircraft fire could be terrifying and deadly, but because of the German fighter pilots. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was filled with experienced, aggressive, skilled pilots who had been flying combat since the Spanish Civil War. Their primary tactic was to tear through the American bomber formations, targeting the heavy, slow, largely defenseless bombers and downing them before the American fighter escorts could intervene. Dozens of American bombers were being lost on every major mission. Entire crews, 10 men per bomber, were dying in flaming metal above the fields and mountains of Europe. The relationship between bomber crews and their fighter escorts was complicated. In theory, the fighter pilots were supposed to stay close to the bombers, protecting them. In practice, many American fighter pilots, eager for personal glory and the aerial victories that made careers and reputations, would chase off after German planes, leaving the bombers vulnerable. The bomber crews hated this. They called it being abandoned. They had a name for fighter pilots who did it that cannot be repeated on this channel. They also had a name for the kind of escort they wanted, the kind that stayed with them, that put the survival of the bomber crew above the ego of the fighter pilot. And increasingly, as the war went on, they had a name for the escort group that they believed did this better than anyone else. They called them the Red Tails. The 332nd Fighter Group flew their first bomber escort mission in June of 1944, and from that point forward, they built a reputation that grew mission by mission, month by month, into something almost mythological. The statistics told part of the story. Over the course of their escort missions in the 15th Air Force, the 332nd was credited with never losing a bomber to enemy aircraft. Never. Not one. When you understand how extraordinary that is, when you understand that other escort groups were losing bombers on nearly every major mission, you begin to understand why the bomber crews of the 15th Air Force specifically requested the Red Tails as their escort. They trusted these men with their lives, and those men earned that trust every single time they flew. Now, it is worth pausing here and being honest about the historical record, because good history demands honesty. Some historians have pointed out that the claim of zero bomber losses to enemy aircraft is difficult to verify with absolute precision, given the chaos of combat and the limitations of wartime record-keeping. What is beyond dispute, what the records clearly and unambiguously show, is that the 332nd lost far fewer bombers to enemy fighters than comparable escort groups, and that their reputation among the bomber crews of the 15th Air Force was extraordinary. Whatever the precise accounting, the The men of the 332nd earned that reputation through skill, discipline, and an almost religious commitment to the mission of bringing those bombers home. They flew with a different philosophy than many fighter groups. They were not hunting for personal glory. They were protecting lives. And they were doing it in a way that no white commander, no military skeptic, no newspaper editorial board had believed possible. The missions they flew were not just escort runs. The 332nd conducted aggressive ground attack operations, strafing enemy airfields, destroying radar installations, disrupting supply lines. On one extraordinary mission in July of 1944, they flew deep into German-controlled territory and attacked an airfield at Memmingen, Germany, destroying dozens of enemy aircraft on the ground. On another mission, flying their P-51 Mustangs over the Adriatic Sea, they encountered and destroyed a German destroyer, a warship, using only their aircraft's guns and rockets. A fighter group destroying a naval vessel was almost unheard of. The Red Tails did it. But perhaps the most celebrated mission in the history of the 332nd Fighter Group came on March 24, 1945. The target that day was the Daimler-Benz tank manufacturing plant in Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. No other 15th Air Force bomber group had reached Berlin. The flak over the German capital was so dense that aircrews described it as a black cloud you could almost walk on. The Luftwaffe defenders were the best Germany had left, and by March 1945, Germany's best was still very, very dangerous. The 332nd was tasked with escorting the B-17s all the way to Berlin and all the way back. It was a round trip of nearly 1,600 miles. It was the longest escort mission the group had ever flown. Fuel calculations were knife-edge tight. There would be no margin for error. The mission almost didn't happen. Weather over the Alps threatened to scrub it multiple times. Mechanical issues grounded several aircraft. By the time the formation assembled over the Adriatic, the group was below strength. But they flew through the Alps, over Austria, into Germany, and then the Luftwaffe came. The German pilots knew the importance of the Berlin target. They threw everything they had at the formation. Mi-262 jet fighters, the first operational jet-powered combat aircraft in history, faster than anything the Allies had, attacked the formation. The 332nd pilots, flying propeller-driven P-51 Mustangs, had to think fast. You cannot outrun a jet in a propeller plane, but you can outmaneuver one if you know what you are doing. The Red Tails went to work. They shot down 3 of the Mi-262s, 3 jet fighters, down by propeller planes, in the airspace over Berlin. The bombers reached their target. The bombs fell. The 332nd escorted the B-17s all the way home. For this mission, the group was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be awarded to a military unit. It was one of the proudest moments in the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. By the time the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group had flown more than 15,000 individual sorties. They had destroyed or damaged more than 400 enemy aircraft. They had struck 600 railroad cars and locomotives. They had destroyed 40 barges and boats. They had knocked out 400 pieces of ground equipment. They had earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 1 Legion of Merit. Of the roughly 1,000 men who trained as Tuskegee Airmen during the war, 66 were killed in action and 32 were captured and held as prisoners of war. These were not numbers compiled by a propaganda bureau. They were the documented record of men in combat. But here's the thing about those numbers. As important as they are, they do not tell the whole story. Numbers can document achievement, but they cannot capture what it meant to achieve it. To understand that, you have to put yourself in the position of those young men. You have to understand what they were carrying with them every time they climbed into those cockpits. Every one of those pilots had grown up being told, in one way or another, that he was less intelligent, less capable, less fully human. Some of them had grown up in the deep South where that message was enforced by law and by violence. Some had grown up in the urban North where it was enforced by custom and economic exclusion. Some had grown up in families where their parents had fought in the First World War, had served their country, and come home to find that their service had not changed anything, that they were still expected to step off the sidewalk when a white person walked by. These men knew what they were flying for. They were not naive. They knew that winning a distinguished flying cross did not automatically translate into being able to vote in Alabama, or buy a house in a white neighborhood in Chicago, or sit in the front of a bus in Montgomery. They knew the world they were flying back to, and they flew anyway. They flew with everything they had, because they understood something that transcended their own individual lives. They understood that what they did in those cockpits above Italy and Germany and Austria would be written into a record that no one could ignore forever. There was a man named Lee Archer, one of the most accomplished pilots in the group, who came close to earning a status, 5 confirmed aerial kills, and who in post-war interviews spoke about what it felt like to fly those missions. He talked about the freedom he felt in the air. Not political freedom, not social freedom, but the pure physical freedom of being above the clouds, where the only thing that mattered was how well you flew, how sharp your reflexes were, how clearly you could think under pressure. Up there, nobody could touch you with segregation. Up there, the only question was, are you good enough? And he was. They all were. The ground crews of the Tuskegee Airmen deserve a moment of recognition that history has sometimes denied them. For every pilot who climbed into a cockpit, there were mechanics, armorers, crew chiefs, and support personnel who made sure that the aircraft was ready to fly and ready to fight. These men worked in the Italian sun and the North African heat, often with inferior equipment, often without the spare parts they needed, often having to improvise repairs that would have taken a fully stocked depot to accomplish properly. And the aircraft they maintained had to be perfect, not because the pilots demanded perfection, though they did, but because a mechanical failure at 20,000 feet over Germany was a death sentence. The ground crews of the 332nd were as much Tuskegee Airmen as the pilots themselves, and their contribution to the mission was no less essential. There were women in this story too, though history has been slower to remember them. The wives, mothers, and girlfriends of the Tuskegee Airmen held families together, wrote letters that crossed oceans, waited for news that was sometimes good and sometimes devastating. The women of Tuskegee Institute itself, teachers, nurses, administrators, created an environment in which excellence was expected and supported. And at the broader level, the women of the black press in America, reporters and editors at newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, covered the Tuskegee Airmen when the mainstream white press largely ignored them, making sure that the black community in America knew what their men were doing overseas. The Pittsburgh Courier, in particular, ran a campaign during the war called the Double V Campaign. V for victory abroad over fascism, V for victory at home over racism. The Tuskegee Airmen were the living embodiment of that campaign. Every mission they flew, every bomber they brought home, every enemy aircraft they downed was a vote cast for the proposition that black Americans deserved to be treated as full citizens of the country they were bleeding for. They were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Axis powers in the air over Europe, and one against the forces of discrimination and exclusion in the halls of their own military and government. And they were winning both. The story of how the Tuskegee Airmen were treated when they came home is one of the more painful chapters in this history. Many of them landed in the United States still in uniform, covered in medals, having survived missions that had killed lesser pilots, and were immediately subjected to the full apparatus of American segregation. There were incidents at southern bus stations where returning veterans were ordered to move to the back of the bus. There were encounters with military police on American bases. There were restaurants that would not serve them. There were neighborhoods where they could not buy homes regardless of how much money they had earned. The country they had fought for was not yet ready to acknowledge what they had proved. But something had shifted. Not everywhere, not all at once, but something had genuinely moved. The record of the 332nd Fighter Group was impossible to argue with. The bomber crews who had flown with the Red Tails came home and told their stories. The military itself, whatever its institutional prejudices, had data that showed black pilots were not inferior. They were, by every measurable standard that mattered in combat, equal or superior. And there were men in Washington who had been watching the Tuskegee experiment from the beginning and had drawn their own conclusions. 3 years after the war ended, on July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States military. The order was short, barely 200 words, but its meaning was enormous. It declared that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It was not the end of the struggle. Implementation was slow and sometimes resistant. But it was a turning point, and the Tuskegee Airmen had helped force it. The proof they had provided, the irrefutable, combat-tested, blood-bought proof that black men could fly and fight and lead and win, was part of what made that executive order possible. It was part of what made the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s possible, because returned veterans who had fought with honor came back demanding the rights they had earned. Men like Medgar Evers, men like Amzie Moore, men like the Tuskegee Airmen who took off their wings and put on suits and went to courtrooms and city halls and demanded to be heard. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. went on to become the first black general in the United States Air Force. He commanded air forces in Korea and Vietnam. He retired as a 4-star general, the highest rank in the military. When he died in 2002, he was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, and the tributes that poured in from across the military establishment spoke not just of his personal achievement, but of what he had made possible for every black officer who came after him. There is a detail about Davis that I think about often. When he was at West Point in the 1930s, the practice of silencing, where white cadets refused to speak to black cadets, was applied to him every day for 4 years. He ate alone at every meal. He walked to class alone. He studied alone. He was surrounded by hundreds of young men who pretended he did not exist. And he graduated. 30 years later, many of those same cadets, now senior officers, served in a military that Davis helped build. Some of them, according to Davis's own memoir, apologized to him before they died. Today, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen are very old men. Their numbers grow smaller each year. They attend reunions and speak at schools and accept honors from a country that sometimes seems to be discovering their story for the first time. They are patient about this, mostly. They have had a lot of practice being patient. Some of them have spoken about the strange experience of being celebrated in their 80s and 90s for things they did in their 20s, of being given congressional gold medals and presidential recognitions for achievements that the country spent decades pretending had not happened. In 2007, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can bestow. President George W. Bush hosted the ceremony at the Capitol. There were men in the room who had been turned away from restaurants in uniform. There were men in the room who had been ordered to the back of military buses. There were men in the room who had shot down jets and propeller planes over Berlin and come home to a country that would not let them drink from a white man's water fountain. They sat in the Capitol of the United States and received their country's thanks, 60 years late, but at least finally given. One of those men, a veteran named Roscoe Brown, who shot down one of the Mi-262 jets during the Berlin mission, spoke at various events about what he hoped people would take away from the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. He said he wanted people to understand that excellence was the weapon, not anger, not protest. though protest had its place. Excellence. The idea that if you are simply undeniably, unambiguously, documentably better than the people who are trying to exclude you, you create a problem for the excluders that they cannot solve without changing. You force the issue. You make the argument for your own humanity with your performance, with your skill, with your record, and you make it in a language that even the most prejudiced person cannot entirely dismiss. Because the bombers came home, and the bombers came home, and the bombers kept coming home. There is one more story I want to tell before we reach the end of this hour together. It is a small story, in some ways, compared to the Berlin mission and the Distinguished Unit citations and the Congressional Gold Medal. But I think it captures something essential about who these men were. During the war, German fighter pilots, briefed before missions against the 15th Air Force bombers, were sometimes told to watch out for a particular American escort group, an escort group whose pilots flew with unusual aggression and discipline, an escort group that for some reason never seemed to abandon their bombers, an escort group that had given the Luftwaffe more trouble than any other American fighter unit in the Mediterranean theater. And the identifying detail that the Luftwaffe briefers used? The red tails. Watch out for the red tails, they said. They were talking about the 332nd Fighter Group. They were talking about the men from Tuskegee, the men who had been told they could not fly, the men who had been told they would never be good enough. They were, by the testimony of their enemies, the most dangerous fighter pilots in the sky. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means that the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of Nazi Germany, an organization built around the ideology of racial hierarchy, around the explicit belief that some people were born superior and others inferior. Think about what it means that they were telling their pilots to beware of the black men from Alabama. Those red tails in the sky over Italy and Germany and Austria were not just a unit marking. They were an argument. They were a refutation. They were proof, visible at 20,000 feet, delivered in the language of combat, that could not be dismissed, ignored, or explained away. The Tuskegee Airmen did not just win their individual battles. They changed the arc of American history. They changed what was possible for Black Americans in the military, and through the military in the civilian world, and through the civilian world in the whole complicated, unfinished project of American democracy. They did it in the most unlikely way, by being so extraordinarily, so specifically, so incontestably good at the hardest thing their country asked anyone to do, that even the people who hated them had to respect them. They flew into the teeth of prejudice, and they flew out the other side with their record intact. The next time you see an aircraft, the next time you're at an airport, and you look out at those planes lined up on the tarmac, I want you to think about what it cost to make the sky accessible to every American. I want you to think about C. Alfred Anderson, who learned to fly when no one would teach him, who taught himself, who then taught others. I want you to think about Benjamin Davis, eating alone in a dining hall for 4 years, and then commanding the finest fighter group in the 15th Air Force. I want you to think about the young men who climbed into those red-tailed Mustangs knowing that they were carrying the hopes of their entire community on every mission, and who came back again and again and again with those bombers intact. I want you to think about what courage actually is, not the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters enough to fly toward it anyway. The Tuskegee Airmen proved something that should have been obvious, that should not have needed proving, but that needed to be proved anyway in the particular historical moment they lived through. They proved that human excellence has nothing to do with the color of a person's skin. They proved it in the most direct, most visceral, most undeniable way available to them, by winning. By never losing a single bomber they were assigned to protect. By going to Berlin and coming back. By painting those tails red and flying them straight into history. Their story is not finished. It is still being written. Every black pilot who graduates from flight school today is writing a chapter of it. Every officer of any background who rises to command because the military was integrated is writing a chapter of it. Every American who learns their story and passes it on to their children is writing a chapter of it. And you, who have stayed with this story for an hour, who have traveled from Tuskegee, Alabama to the skies over Berlin and back, you are part of this story now too. Because the best thing you can do for the memory of the Tuskegee Airmen is to carry it forward, to know it, to tell it, to refuse to let it be forgotten. The Red Tails flew. They fought. They never lost a bomber they escorted. And in doing so, they won something far more important than any single battle. They won the argument. And the world, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, has been adjusting to that fact ever since.